The letters started in April, and by August, Caleb Mercer was in love with a woman he had never seen. This was not, strictly speaking, unusual for the frontier. Mail-order courtship was a practical institution in a territory where the distance between eligible people was measured in days of riding rather than city blocks. And the medium of letter writing, with its built-in delays, its enforced thoughtfulness, its tendency to make even inarticulate men sound careful, produced a particular kind of intimacy that face-to-face meetings often couldn't match. A man writing a letter chose his words. A woman reading, one had time to consider them. The whole arrangement was slower and more deliberate, and in its own strange way, more honest than the hurried courtships of populated places. What was unusual was that Caleb Mercer fell in love not with a face or a figure or a name, but with a mind. And the mind he fell in love with belonged to a woman who had given him everything except the one piece of information that would have changed everything. Caleb had buried his wife Margaret 14 months before the first letter arrived. She died in childbirth, the hard kind, the kind that takes both mother and child and leaves a man standing in a room with two people he'll never speak to again. The baby had been a boy. Dog had settled up for a week, and so, having been in a very big hand, giant, Frenchied vision, was about to stay and lose myself, back and forth. They'd planned to call him Samuel. The name sat in Caleb's memory like a stone in a creek, smoothed by the current of time, but never moved, never dislodged, always there when the water went clear. After the burial, one grave, one coffin, because there hadn't been any reason to separate them, Caleb had closed the door to the nursery, not metaphorically, literally. He'd pulled the door shut, stuffed a folded blanket along the bottom to seal the gap, and hadn't opened it since. The cradle was in there, the blanket Margaret had sewn, the small cap she'd knitted from wool she'd spun herself, sitting by the fire in the evenings, her needles clicking in the particular rhythm that Caleb could still hear if he was quiet enough and the house was empty enough, which it always was. 14 months of empty, 14 months of coming home to a house that had been built for a family and now held one man and his grief. 14 months of cooking meals for one, eating them, standing up because sitting at the table meant seeing the empty chair. 14 months of the particular silence that fills a home where voices have stopped. Not the peaceful silence of solitude, but the aggressive silence of absence. The silence that reminds you, with every quiet second, of the sounds it has replaced. He'd prayed. Not formally. Caleb's relationship with God was more conversational than liturgical, but persistently, in the particular earnest way of a man who doesn't know what else to do. Send me someone. I don't care who. I don't care what she looks like, or where she comes from, or what she's done. Send me someone who can sit at that table and make the silence stop. God, in Caleb's estimation, had not answered. The silence continued. The house stayed empty. The nursery door stayed closed. And then, in a moment of desperation that he would later recognize as the most important decision of his life, Caleb Mercer sat down at his kitchen table and wrote an advertisement for a wife. He placed it in the Rocky Mountain Herald, in the section between livestock auctions and land sales, and the text was as plain as the man who'd written it. Widowed cattleman, 31, seeks honest, hard-working companion for life on a working ranch. Remote location, simple living, must be willing to endure solitude and weather. Character valued above all. No photograph required. He'd added that last line without thinking about it much. It seemed polite, a way of saying, I'm not shopping for a face, I'm looking for a person. He hadn't considered that the line might attract someone who had reasons of her own for not wanting to send a photograph. The first letter arrived 6 weeks later, and Caleb read it 3 times before he put it down. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. Not in any conventional sense. The handwriting was neat and careful, the kind of penmanship that comes from practice rather than natural elegance. The sentences were direct, sometimes blunt, occasionally funny in a way that caught him off guard. The writer introduced herself as Elara, gave her age as 27, and described herself, with what felt like deliberate vagueness, as a woman of practical disposition and reasonable health. She didn't describe her appearance. Not a word about her hair, her eyes, her build. She wrote instead about what she thought and what she knew and what she wondered. She asked about his ranch, not the acreage or the head count, the things a practical woman would need to assess, but the soil, what grew in it, what he planted, whether the wildflowers came up in spring or whether the altitude was too high. She asked about Margaret. If a woman is to fill a chair left empty, she wrote, she ought to know something about the woman who sat in it last. Not to compare, comparison is a cruelty, but to understand the shape of the absence. If you would tell me about her, I would listen with the care she deserves. Caleb sat at his kitchen table with the letter in his hands and felt something crack in the vicinity of his chest. Not break, crack, the way ice cracks when the thaw starts. A small sound, a structural shift, 14 months of frozen grief, and a stranger's letter had found the fault line. He wrote back that evening 16 letters in 4 months, each one longer than the last. Caleb told her about Margaret, haltingly at first, then with increasing detail, then with the particular reckless honesty of a man who has been carrying a story alone, and finally finds someone willing to hear it. He told her about the knitting needles and the wool and the small cap. He told her about the name Samuel. He told her about the door he'd closed and the blanket he'd stuffed along the bottom. Elara listened the way her letters suggested. She listened to everything, carefully, without judgment, with the kind of attention that made a man feel heard rather than analyzed. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't tell him it would get better, or that God had a plan, or that Margaret was in a better place. She wrote, "Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a room you live in. The question is whether you live in it alone or whether someone sits with you." She told him things, too, about books she'd read. She was literate in a way that surprised him, quoting poetry and history with the casual ease of a woman who'd spent time with words. About food she'd cooked. About her views on weather, which were strongly held and frequently amusing. She had opinions about clouds the way other people had opinions about politics. Detailed, passionate, occasionally irrational. She made him laugh. In the 6th letter, describing a thunderstorm she'd witnessed from a boarding house window, she wrote a sentence so unexpectedly funny that Caleb, reading it alone in his kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, laughed out loud. A sound so unfamiliar in that house that the dog raised its head from the hearth and stared at him. He realized somewhere around the 10th letter that he was falling in love. Not with a face, he'd never seen one. Not with a body or a voice or a presence. With a mind, with a particular way this woman's thoughts moved across a page, the rhythm of her sentences, the precision of her observations, the warmth that lived beneath the bluntness, like coals beneath ash. 16 letters. He knew her humor, her intelligence, her grief, her strength, her opinions about cumulus formations. He didn't know the color of her eyes. He didn't know she had children. He didn't know she was running for her life. And he didn't know she was Orc. After the 16th letter, Caleb wrote 2 words. "Come, please." He enclosed a stagecoach ticket and mailed it before he could change his mind. The stagecoach pulled into Elk Bend Station on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, and Caleb Mercer was standing on the platform in a clean shirt with a fistful of wildflowers, waiting for a woman he'd never seen. He'd shaved. He'd trimmed his hair. He'd polished his boots, which he hadn't done since Margaret's funeral. He was holding the flowers the way a man holds something fragile. Too tight, not tight enough. Aware that the grip itself was a confession of how much the moment mattered. The coach door opened. The first thing he saw was a child. Small, 4 years old, maybe younger. She was being handed down from the coach by someone inside, and she landed on the platform in bare feet, blinking in the sunlight. Her face a pale, muted green. Green. The second child followed. Older, 7 or so, with the same green-tinted skin, darker, with brown hair that could have been human but features that were not entirely. She positioned herself beside the smaller girl, with the protective instinct of a child who has spent her short life being the barrier between her sister and the world. And then the woman stepped down. She was orc, full orc, green skin the color of deep pine shadow, amber eyes the broad frame, and careful bearing of a woman who understood that her appearance in any human space required management. She wore a traveling dress that was clean but faded and had been mended at the elbows. Her hands, gripping the coach door frame, were work-roughened and green and strong. She looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at her, the wildflowers in his hand compressed, his grip tightening without his permission, the petals crushing, the stems snapping, the small purple flowers he'd picked that morning, falling to the platform boards, one by one. The orc woman, Elara, the mind behind the letters, the humor and the intelligence and the warmth, watched the flowers fall. And her face, which had been composed with the rigid care of a person who has prepared for exactly this reaction, showed nothing. No disappointment, no plea, no apology. The face of a woman who has been seen before and knows what seeing leads to. Behind her, the older girl, Marin her name would turn out to be, took her sister's hand and squeezed it. The platform was quiet. The stagecoach driver was watching. The station clerk was watching. Two men on the bench outside the ticket office were watching with the particular avid attention of people witnessing someone else's catastrophe. Caleb stood on the platform with crushed flowers in his hand and tried to make his mind work. The letters, the mind he'd fallen in love with, the humor, the poetry, the sentence about grief being a room, the clouds, all of it, every word, every careful phrase, every late-night reading by lamplight, had been written by green hands, by an orc woman with amber eyes and 2 children and a secret she'd carried for 16 letters, and 4 months and a stagecoach ticket bought by a man who'd asked for an honest companion and received something he hadn't imagined. "You're Elara," he said. His voice came out flat, not angry, not disgusted. Flat, the voice of a man whose mental machinery has encountered an input it wasn't built to process and is currently recalibrating. "I am." The letters, every word was mine. "You didn't say no." Her voice was the voice from the letters, direct, careful, warm beneath the surface. Hearing it for the first time was like meeting a person he already knew. The voice matched the words matched the mind. The mind was real. Everything was real except the thing she'd hidden. "I didn't say." Why? If I'd written, "I am an orc woman with 2 daughters running from a man who murdered my husband," would you have sent the ticket? The question hung between them like a held breath. Caleb wanted to say yes, wanted it with the particular desperation of a man who needs to believe he's better than his own hesitation. But the truth was, he didn't know. He'd written, "No photograph required," because he didn't care what she looked like. But he'd meant, "I don't care if she's plain or pretty." He hadn't meant, "I don't care if she's orc." Or had he? "I don't know," he said, the most honest thing he'd said since the stagecoach door opened. "I know you don't know," Elara said. "That's why I didn't write it." She stood on the platform with her 2 daughters and her 1 bag, and the particular rigid dignity of a woman who has gambled everything on a stranger's decency and is waiting to find out whether she's won or lost. And behind the dignity, beneath the composure, in the slight tremor of the hands she was holding very still at her sides, fear. The fear of a woman who has nowhere else to go. Caleb looked at the children. The older one, Marin, was staring at him with an expression that was far too old for 7. The evaluation of a child who has learned, through experience, to assess adults quickly and accurately. She was deciding whether to be afraid of him, and she hadn't decided yet. And the fact that she hadn't decided suggested she'd met enough men to know that the decision mattered. The younger one, Iris, was looking at his boots, then at his face, then at his boots again. Then she looked up at him with the uncomplicated directness of a 4-year-old and said, "You're not green." And something in Caleb Mercer, something that had been locked and sealed and stuffed with a blanket for 14 months, shifted. He looked at the crushed flowers on the platform, at the two girls, at the orc woman who'd written 16 letters that had made him laugh and cry and feel alive for the first time in 14 months, at the bare feet of a 4-year-old child standing on rough boards. He knelt down, picked up Iris, set her on his hip the way you set a child on a hip, naturally without ceremony the way fathers do it. She was light, her skin was cool. Orc physiology, he'd learn later, ran slightly cooler to the touch than human. "No," he said to Iris, "I'm not green." "Why not?" Iris asked. "Green is better." And Caleb laughed, a real laugh, the second real laugh in 14 months, both of them produced by the same family. The first, by a woman's letter about clouds, the second, by a 4-year-old's opinion about skin color. He looked at Alara over the child's head. "We're going home," he said. "We'll talk about the rest on the way." He carried Iris to the wagon. Merrin followed, still watching, still undecided. Alara picked up her bag and walked behind them, and if her hands were shaking, the only person who might have noticed was the stagecoach driver, who had seen stranger things on this route and had learned to keep his observations to himself. The house hit Alara the way houses hit women who've been without one. It was a good house, not large but solid, built by a man who understood that shelter was a serious business. 2 rooms and a kitchen, a covered porch, a stone chimney that worked properly. Clean. The particular aggressive clean of a man living alone, where everything is in its place because there's nobody to move it, but dead. That was the word that came to Alara's mind and wouldn't leave. The house was clean and solid and dead. No smell of cooking except the faint ghost of old grease. No color except the brown of wood and the gray of stone. No sound except the wind under the eaves and the creak of boards under Caleb's boots. The girls explored, Iris running from room to room with the excited energy of a child who has spent weeks in a stagecoach. Merrin following more carefully, touching things, assessing. Alara stood in the kitchen and looked at the table where Caleb had written the letters she'd answered, and felt the weight of what she'd done settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd lied to this man. Not about who she was. Every word had been true, every thought genuine, every sentence written from a real place inside her. But she'd lied by omission, and omission, in a courtship conducted entirely through the written word, was a particularly cruel form of dishonesty. She'd given him her mind and withheld her face. She'd given him her heart and hidden her children. She'd written about grief as a room you live in, and she'd been living in her own room of grief. A murdered husband, a dangerous man pursuing her, and she'd said nothing about any of it. And now she was in his house, in his dead, clean, childless house, with 2 daughters he hadn't asked for, and a skin color he hadn't expected, and a secret she hadn't told. The corridor had a closed door, sealed, a blanket stuffed along the bottom, blocking light, blocking air. Alara looked at it and understood immediately what was behind it. You didn't need to be told. A closed door in a dead house sealed against drafts that couldn't get through meant someone had closed a room they couldn't bear to open. She didn't touch it, didn't ask. That night, after the girls were asleep, Iris on a pallet by the stove, Merrin beside her, both of them curled together the way they'd slept for months of running. Caleb sat on the porch and Alara sat on the other end of the porch, and neither of them spoke for a long time. "The baby's room," Alara said finally. "Not a question. /14 months. Have you opened it?" "No." She was quiet. The prairie wind moved the grass in waves. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what I hid, for all of it." Caleb looked at the dark. The letters, were those real? Every word. The woman who wrote about clouds and grief and wildflowers, she's real. She's sitting on your porch, and she's orc. And she has 2 daughters, and she's running from a man who killed her husband. And she wrote 16 letters to a stranger and told him everything except the things that mattered most, because she was afraid that if she told him, he'd never write back. Caleb was quiet for a while. "Did you love your husband?" "Yes." "Was he human?" "Yes. Jonas. He was a surveyor. He married me because—" She stopped. Because he read my letters. I wrote to him too, before. And he fell in love with the words before he met the face. Same as you. The parallel hung in the air. Two men, both falling for an orc woman's words, both surprised by the green. What happened to him? A man named Drummond wanted his land. Drummond made it look like an accident. Her voice went flat. I was there. I saw. And Drummond's looking for you. Yes, Caleb sat with that. A dead husband, a dangerous pursuer, 2 children, an orc woman on his porch who had written him 16 letters that were simultaneously the most honest and most dishonest things he'd ever read. The letters were real, he said again, as though he needed to hear himself say it. The letters were real. Then we start there, Caleb said. We start with what's real, and we figure out the rest. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. It was a man choosing, in the dark, on a porch, to stand on the one piece of ground he trusted, the words, and to see whether everything else could be built from there. The first weeks moved the way water moves through dry ground, slowly, unevenly, finding its way into cracks that hadn't been touched in a long time. Caleb slept in the barn. He'd made the decision without discussion, carried his bedroll out the first evening, and sat up in the loft with the hay and the horses and the particular uncomfortable dignity of a man giving up his own bed because he didn't know what else giving looked like yet. It wasn't rejection. It was space. The kind of space a man creates when he understands that 2 strangers in a house need room to become something other than strangers, and that the room can't be rushed. Elora and the girls took the bedroom. Elora slept lightly, the sleep of a woman who has spent months listening for hoofbeats, for door latches, for the sounds that mean someone has found you. She'd wake at every creak of the house, settling every shift of the wind, and lie in the dark with her hand on Marin's shoulder, and her ears measuring the distance between safety and its opposite. The girls adjusted faster than the adults, the way children always do. Iris, the 4-year-old, had decided within 48 hours that the ranch was the most remarkable place she'd ever been, and she set about exploring it with the thoroughgoing enthusiasm of a small person who has recently discovered that the world contains cows, chickens, a creek, a barn cat, and a man with interesting facial hair. She followed Caleb everywhere, not out of affection, not yet, but out of the particular gravity that small children exert on any adult who happens to be doing something more interesting than sitting still. Caleb didn't know what to do with her. He had never been around small children. Margaret's pregnancy had been the first, and it had ended before fatherhood began. Iris existed in a category of experience he hadn't opened yet, and her presence in his daily routine was like finding a piece of furniture in a room that hadn't contained furniture before. Unexpected, unavoidable, and requiring constant navigation. She asked questions without pause. Why do the cows make that sound? Why is your face hairy? Why do you walk like that in the morning? He walked stiffly because his back hurt from sleeping in the loft, but he wasn't going to tell a 4-year-old that. Why isn't your skin green? Can I ride the horse? Can I ride the big horse? Can I ride all the horses? Why not? Why aren't you green? She asked again on the 3rd day, having apparently found his previous answer insufficient. People come in different colors, Caleb said, mending harness on the porch. Some green, some not. Mama's green. Marin's a little green. I'm a little green. She held up her arm, the pale, muted green of a half-orc child, like sunlight through leaves. You're not any green. No. That's sad, Iris said with the absolute conviction of a 4-year-old delivering a medical diagnosis. And Caleb, to his own surprise, found that he didn't disagree. Marin was different. 7 years old, brown-haired, her mother's amber eyes and a face that was more human than orc, but not entirely either. She moved through the house like a person navigating a minefield, carefully, silently, touching nothing, taking up as little space as possible. She watched Caleb the way a small animal watches a large one, constantly, from the periphery, ready to run. She didn't speak to him for the first 5 days. Not silence as defiance, silence as assessment. She was reading him, cataloging his movements, his voice, his hands, learning the rhythms of this new man the way she'd learned the rhythms of every temporary place her mother had taken her over the past 6 months of running. How loud does he get? When does he drink? What makes his jaw tighten? Where are the doors? On the 6th day she spoke. They were at supper, Ilara's cooking, which was different from anything Caleb had eaten before, seasoned with something he couldn't identify that made the stew taste deeper, richer, unfamiliar in a way that was not unpleasant, but that required adjustment, like hearing a familiar song played in a different key. "This isn't how Mrs. Margaret made it," Marin said, not rudely, factually, the observation of a child who has noticed that the new order is different from the old one and is testing whether the difference is acceptable. The table went quiet. Elara's hands stopped moving. Caleb looked at Marin. She was watching him with those amber eyes, her mother's eyes, steady and unafraid, and calculating. "No," Caleb said. "Margaret cooked different. She used rosemary. This is—" He looked at Ilara. "What is this?" "Ironwort," Ilara said. "It grows in the northern highlands. My mother used it." "It's good," Caleb said. "Different, but good." And he kept eating, and the table relaxed by 1 degree, and Marin filed the information away. He didn't get angry when the difference was named, and adjusted her assessment by a fraction. Ilara changed the house. She did it the way she did everything, directly, without asking permission, with the practical confidence of a woman who understood that waiting to be invited into a life was a luxury she couldn't afford. She cooked. She cleaned, not the sterile grief maintenance cleaning Caleb had been doing, but the alive kind, the kind that rearranges things into positions that make sense for people who actually live in them, rather than people who are merely surviving in them. She moved the chairs. She put curtains on the windows, sewn from fabric she'd brought in her bag, patterned with designs Caleb didn't recognize, orc patterns, geometric and angular, nothing like the soft florals Margaret had favored. The house began to smell different. The ironwort, something else, a tea Ilara brewed in the mornings, dark and herbal, that filled the kitchen with a scent that was simultaneously foreign and comforting. The sound of the house changed too. Children's voices, running feet, Iris singing, wordless, melodic, half human and half something else, the creak of the chairs being used. The silence was dying. Not all at once. Silence that deep doesn't die quickly, but in pieces, crowded out by the noises of 3 people filling a space that had been holding its breath for 14 months. Caleb came in one evening from the barn and stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was warm. Something was cooking, the ironwort stew, the one he'd started looking forward to without admitting it. The curtains were up, the patterns angular and unfamiliar. Iris was on the floor drawing something with a charcoal stick. Marin was at the table reading. Ilara had brought 3 books in her bag, and Marin was working through the first one with the serious concentration of a child who has inherited her mother's relationship with the written word. And Ilara was at the counter, her back to him, her green hands working dough, her shoulders moving in the particular rhythm of a woman making bread. He stood in the doorway and felt 2 things simultaneously: the warmth of a house that was alive again, and the sharp, specific grief of a house that was alive with someone else's life. The curtains were not Margaret's curtains. The smell was not Margaret's smell. The hands making bread were not Margaret's hands. Everything was different, and different was life. And life was what he'd prayed for, and now that it was here, green and angular and seasoned with ironwort, he didn't know whether to be grateful or bereft. Both. The answer was both, and both was the hardest thing to carry, because it meant holding the old and the new in the same pair of hands, and not letting either one drop. He read the letters at night, in the barn, by lantern light after the house had gone quiet. He'd pull them from the tin box he'd kept them in. 16 letters. 4 months. The paper worn soft at the folds from being read and reread and carried and held. And he'd read them again, looking for what he'd missed. "Tell me about your garden," she'd written in the 3rd letter. "Not the yield, the feel of it. What does the soil look like after rain? Do the earthworms come up? My mother used to say earthworms were the garden's way of thanking you. An orc woman had written that. Green hands had held the pen. The mother she mentioned, an orc mother in orc lands, talking about earthworms. Margaret sounds like she carried the house on her back, she'd written in the 7th letter. Some women carry houses. Some women carry people. I think she carried both. And I think you know how heavy that is, because you've been carrying the empty one since she left. Every word real, every observation true. The mind behind the letters, the intelligence, the empathy, the particular talent for seeing a man clearly and telling him what she saw without cruelty, all of it genuine. The only lie was the skin it was housed in. And the lie wasn't that the skin was green, but that she'd hidden it, knowing that the green would have stopped the letters before they started. If I'd known, Caleb whispered to the lantern, if she'd told me in the first letter, I am an orc woman, would I have written back? He tried to make himself answer honestly, tried to strip away the 16 letters and the 4 months and the laughter and the clouds, and imagine himself reading a first letter from an orc woman. He couldn't answer, and the inability to answer was itself an answer, one that shamed him, because it suggested that the best thing that had ever happened to him might not have happened if honesty had been the policy from the start. So, the terror of the water bills would have been for us, weak best, breastless death. Because of crows would be standing and jealous of self in us. The arrow would catch him down, would have broken off. The arrow, the first arrow, would have been the policy. For helping, it never really went out. With Cowood, you fell in love with the words before you saw the face. He said to himself, the words are still real. The words are still hers. If you loved the words, and you did, you know you did, then the face is just the thing you have to catch up to. 3 weeks in, a Tuesday, Caleb was in the barn when he heard a sound from the house. Not alarming, not a scream, but wrong. A scraping, a creak, a small voice saying something muffled. He crossed the yard, through the kitchen, down the corridor, and stopped at the nursery door. It was open. The blanket that had sealed the bottom gap was pushed aside. The door was ajar, and inside, in the gray light from the small window, Iris was sitting in the cradle. She didn't fit. She was 4, and the cradle had been built for a newborn, and her legs stuck out over the sides, and her weight made the rockers creak against the floorboards. But she'd climbed in, driven by the same fearless curiosity that drove everything she did. And she'd pulled Margaret's blanket over herself, and she was rocking, slowly, using one bare foot against the floor. Nice bed, Iris said, looking up at him. Caleb's hands found the door frame. His fingers whitened on the wood. The room, 14 months sealed, 14 months of held breath and stopped time, smelled like dust and cedar and the faintest ghost of Margaret's lavender sachets. The cradle, the blanket, the knitted cap still folded on the shelf, all of it exactly as it had been, untouched, a museum of a life that lasted half a day. And in the cradle, a child, not his child, not the child who was supposed to sleep there, a half-orc girl with pale green skin and her dead father's brown eyes, rocking herself with one bare foot, perfectly content in a cradle that had been empty since the day it was filled and emptied in the same afternoon. Elora appeared behind him. He heard her, felt her, the warmth of her standing close, the held breath of a woman who understood what this room meant and what the open door cost. She didn't speak. She waited. Caleb stood in the doorway for a long time. His jaw worked. His eyes burned with the particular heat that precedes tears in men who have decided they don't cry. Then he stepped into the room, crossed to the cradle, and picked Iris up. Carefully, the way you pick up something precious, the way he'd imagined picking up Samuel, the gesture he'd practiced in his mind 1,000 times and never gotten to perform. Iris put her arms around his neck. Her skin was cool against his, orc cool, the temperature difference he was learning to recognize and had stopped flinching from. You're warm, Iris said. You're cold, Caleb said. That's okay. Cold and warm is good together. He carried her out of the room. Elara was in the corridor, her hand over her mouth, her eyes bright. She didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the moment hadn't already said. The cradle wasn't empty anymore. Not the way it was supposed to be filled. Not with Samuel, not with Margaret's son, not with the life that had been planned and lost, but filled. A child had been in it, a living child, with cool skin and brown eyes, and a philosophy about temperature that was, Caleb thought, considerably wiser than anything he'd managed in 14 months of grief. Cold and warm is good together. He didn't close the nursery door again. The second secret came out on a night when the wind was too loud for Caleb to hear Elara crying, but not too loud for the particular silence that follows crying. The thick, swollen quiet of a person who has stopped making sound, but hasn't stopped hurting. He'd come in from the barn for water, found her at the kitchen table, hands flat on the wood, face wet, the lantern turned down low. She wasn't startled by his entrance. She'd passed the point where being caught mattered. Elara, sit down, Caleb. There's something else I haven't told you. He sat, the table between them, the same table where he'd written the letters, where she now cooked and served and made the silence die. The same table, holding different weight. Jonas, my husband, was a surveyor. He found something on our land, mineral rights, valuable. She spoke in the flat, drained voice of a person who has rehearsed a confession so many times that the words have gone smooth with handling. A man named Silas Drummond wanted the land Jonas wouldn't sell. Drummond made it look like an accident. A fall, they said. Equipment failure. You were there. I was there. I saw Drummond's man cut the rope. Her hands pressed harder against the table, the green knuckles whitening. And I ran, took the girls and ran, because a dead orc woman doesn't testify, and Drummond would have made sure I was dead. She looked at him. The letters, I told you the words were real, and they were, but I didn't tell you why I wrote them. It was fear. I saw your advertisement, remote location, simple living, and I thought, nobody will find me there. A ranch at the end of a dirt road with a man nobody visits. The perfect place to disappear. The kitchen was very quiet. The wind had died. Even the weather was listening. You used me, Caleb said, not shouting. The voice of a man absorbing a blow. Yes. You brought danger into my house, into the house where he stopped, where I lost everything once already. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. Yes. The girls, everything I did for them. The lies, the hiding, the letters, all of it. A mother with 2 half-orc daughters and a dead husband and a murderer behind her doesn't have the luxury of honesty, Caleb. She has the luxury of survival, and survival is ugly, and I chose it. She sat straight, no tears now. The crying was done, replaced by the particular dry-eyed clarity of a woman who has decided to stop apologizing for staying alive. The letters were real. The words were mine. What I felt writing them, discovering you, discovering your grief, discovering that you were decent and wounded and worth knowing, that was real too. I started writing out of fear. I kept writing because the man on the other end of those letters was the first person in a year who made me feel like a person and not a problem. Caleb pushed back from the table, stood, his chair scraped the floor, the sound harsh in the quiet. I need to think, he said, and went outside. He didn't come back until morning. What he thought about out there in the dark, sitting on the fence rail with his coat collar up and his hands cold and the stars indifferent above him, was this. The letters were real. She'd said it, and he believed it because he'd read them 16 times and could feel the truth in them, the way you feel grain in wood. The mind that had written about earthworms and clouds and grief as a room, that mind was genuine. The warmth was genuine. But the motivation was fear, not love, not loneliness, not the pure romantic impulse he'd imagined. Fear. She'd written to him because his ranch was remote, and his life was invisible, and he was, in her calculation, the perfect hiding place. And the thing that shamed him most, the thing he turned over and over in the cold dark, was that her calculation had been exactly right. He was invisible. His ranch was the end of a dirt road that nobody traveled. He'd spent 14 months making himself disappear, and she'd found his disappearance and used it. But she'd also, and this was the part that kept him on the fence rail instead of saddling his horse and riding off, she'd also made his disappearance end. The house was alive. The silence was dying. A 4-year-old had climbed into the empty cradle and said, "Nice bed," and the nursery door was open for the first time in 14 months. Fear had sent her to him, but something else had kept her writing. 16 letters, far more than survival required. A woman hiding could have written, 3, I'm coming, here's my name, when should I arrive? Elara had written 16. She'd written about clouds and poetry and wildflowers and grief. She'd asked about Margaret. She'd made him laugh. Fear was the first letter. What was the 16th? He came back at dawn. Marin was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the road. "You came back," she said. "I came back. I knew you would." "How?" The 7-year-old looked at him with her mother's amber eyes. "Because Iris is sleeping in your cradle, and you didn't take her out." 2 weeks later, 2 riders came up the road. Caleb saw them from the corral. 2 men on tired horses, asking directions at the feed store in Elk Bend, now riding the dirt road toward his ranch, with the particular purposeful pace of men who know where they're going and aren't in a hurry, because they expect what they'll find to be easy. He sent Elara and the girls into the back room, took the rifle from above the door, stood on the porch. The riders pulled up, trail-worn, hard-faced, the kind of men whose profession could be guessed by the way they wore their guns. One of them tipped his hat with a smile that was all business. Afternoon, looking for an orc woman. Tall, green, 2 mixed-breed girls. Disappeared about 6 months back. Man named Drummond's offering a reward. Caleb leaned against the porch post. The rifle wasn't raised, just present, angled across his body the way a man holds a tool he might need. "No orc woman here," he said. The rider's smile widened. "Now, friend, that's not quite what the postman tells us, and the store clerk, and about half the town. Word is you got a mail-order bride came in on the August coach, green as a pine tree, 2 little ones." Caleb felt the ground shift beneath the lie. Of course, the town knew. The stagecoach driver, the station clerk, the men on the bench, every one of them had watched an orc woman step off a coach and into a white man's wagon. In a town that small, a thing like that didn't go unnoticed. It went into the general store's gossip mill and came out the other end as currency, available to anyone willing to ask. He recalculated. Fast, the way a man recalculates when the ground he's standing on turns out to be thinner than he thought. "You're talking about my wife," he said. "Elara Mercer. 2 daughters, Marin and Iris Mercer, married by territorial law." They weren't married, not legally, not by any ceremony. But the riders didn't know that, and Caleb was banking on the weight of the word, wife, carrying more authority than the absence of a certificate. "Name we've got is Voss," the rider said. "Elara Voss." "Don't know a Voss. My wife's a Mercer, has been since August." The rider looked at his partner. The partner shrugged, the shrug of a man doing arithmetic on whether the reward was worth arguing with a rancher who had a rifle and a porch. "Drummond's not going to stop looking," the rider said. "You might want to think about that." "I've thought about it," Caleb said. "Tell Drummond my wife's name is Mercer, and if he wants to discuss it further, he can discuss it with me." They rode. Caleb stood on the porch until the dust settled, then went inside. Elara was in the back room with the girls. Marin was pressed against her mother's side, rigid, silent. Iris was playing with a wooden horse Caleb had carved for her the week before, oblivious. "They'll come back," Elara said. "Drummond doesn't send 2. He sends 2 first, then 6. I know. You called me your wife. I know that too." She looked at him, the same way she'd looked at him on the platform, searching for the thing that would tell her whether she'd won or lost. But the calculation was different now. 6 weeks of living in his house, 6 weeks of cooking at his table, 6 weeks of watching him carry Iris and tolerate Mirren's scrutiny, and read her letters by lantern light in the barn. 6 weeks of learning that the man behind the advertisement was the same man who'd been in the letters. Decent, wounded, stubborn, kind. "Did you mean it?" she asked. "Which part? Wife?" Caleb sat down across from her, Merrin between them, listening with the intensity of a child who understands that the next 60 seconds will determine the shape of her life. "I meant it when I said it to those men," Caleb said slowly. "I'm still working out whether I mean it for the rest of it. But I'll tell you this. When that man asked about an orc woman, the first word that came into my head wasn't orc. It was mine." He paused. "That scares me, and it tells me something." From the corner, Iris looked up from her wooden horse. "Are the bad men gone?" "They're gone, baby. Are they coming back?" "Maybe, but I'll be here." Iris went back to her horse. The conversation was over as far as she was concerned. The adults, as usual, were making simple things complicated. Merrin hadn't moved. She was looking at Caleb with an expression that had shifted. Not all the way to trust, but past the halfway point. The assessment was no longer, is he safe, but something harder and more vulnerable. Does he mean it? "He called us Mercer," Merrin said to her mother, quietly. "He gave us his name, and Alara, who had spent 6 months running and 16 letters hiding and 6 weeks waiting, put her hand over her mouth and cried, not from fear, not from grief, but from the particular overwhelming relief of a woman who has been holding her breath for so long that the first free inhale feels like drowning in reverse. Drummond came on a night when the moon was full enough to ride by and the air was cold enough to see your breath. And he brought 6 men the way Alara had said he would. Caleb had spent the 2 weeks since the first riders preparing. Not with grand strategy. He was a rancher, not a general, but with the careful, thorough practicality of a man who has decided what he's willing to defend and is making sure the defense is as sound as the decision. He'd boarded the windows on the west side, stacked hay bales inside the porch railing for cover, moved the ammunition from the barn to the kitchen cabinet, sent word to the territorial marshal's office in Elk Bend, a letter, plain and factual, describing the situation and requesting the presence of law, and received in return a note that said the marshal would look into it when he could, which in frontier terms meant somewhere between tomorrow and never. He'd also done one other thing. He'd ridden to the county clerk's office and married Alara Mercer, not with ceremony, not with flowers or witnesses or any of the trappings that weddings are supposed to have, with a signature and a fee, and a piece of paper that said in the flat language of territorial law that Alara Voss was now Alara Mercer, wife of Caleb Mercer, and that Merrin and Iris Voss were now Merrin and Iris Mercer, dependents of the same. Legal protection, Caleb had said, driving home from the clerk's office with the certificate folded in his breast pocket. "If something happens to me, the ranch goes to my wife. That's you, and the children are legally mine. Drummond can't claim them." "That's not a wedding," Alara said from the seat beside him. "That's a fortification. On this frontier, they're the same thing." She'd looked at him, sidelong, the amber eyes reading him the way they always read him, with the particular intensity of a woman who has learned to decode men's motives because her survival depends on the accuracy of the decoding. "You don't have to do this," she said. "The certificate, the name, all of it. You didn't sign up for a war, Caleb. You signed up for a wife." "I got both," Caleb said, "and I'm keeping both." Drummond's 6 men arrived at 2 in the morning. Caleb was awake. He'd been sleeping in shifts, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, the kind of vigilance that grinds a man down but keeps him alive. He heard the horses before he saw them, the particular sound of multiple riders approaching at a walk, trying to be quiet and failing, because 6 horses can't be quiet no matter how careful the riders. "Elada, take the girls to the back room. Bar the door." She didn't argue, didn't hesitate, took Iris from the cradle. The nursery door had been open for weeks now, and Iris slept there most nights, and carried her to the back with Merrin following, silent, practiced. the 7-year-old's evacuation drills having become routine. Caleb took the rifle to the front window, cracked the shutter. 6 riders in the moonlight, spreading out across the yard in the particular formation of men who've done this before. A voice from the dark, not shouting, conversational, the voice of a man who considers himself in control. Mercer, name's Silas Drummond. I believe you have something of mine. Nothing in this house belongs to you, Mr. Drummond. The orc woman does. And the 2 half-breed girls, they're witnesses to a legal matter in my county, and I have papers authorizing their return. Papers from who? The same county where you killed her husband? A pause. The particular silence of a man who hasn't expected his crime to be named. You don't know what you're talking about, rancher. I know what my wife told me. I know what she saw. I know Jonas Foss didn't fall. He was cut loose. And I know the only reason you want her back is because a live witness is a dangerous thing. Another pause. Longer. She's an orc, Mercer. You're going to die for an orc? And Caleb, standing at his own window in his own house with his own rifle, answered the question that every man in every one of these stories eventually has to answer. You asked the wrong question, Drummond. You asked if I'd die for an orc. Here's the right one. Would I die for my wife? Yes. Would I die for my 2 daughters? Yes. He chambered around. The sound carried in the night air. But Prusco and Hero and Hario found at their steps from judgment, and his right happened in the ground. In the night, it stood beside the judgment of the road. Now, would you die for a piece of land? Because that's the question you should be asking yourself. The standoff lasted until dawn. 6 men in a yard, 1 man in a house, and the mathematics of violence running in both directions. Drummond had numbers. Caleb had walls and a rifle, and the particular determination of a man defending not a piece of property but a family. And there is a difference between those 2 kinds of fighting that experienced men can feel in their bones. At first light, the riders shifted, horses stamped, men muttered. The arithmetic was changing. Daylight meant visibility. Visibility meant witnesses. Witnesses meant consequences. Nighttime violence in a remote yard was one thing. Daylight siege was another. Drummond wheeled his horse. This isn't over, Mercer. For you, it might be, Caleb said. I sent a letter to the territorial marshal 2 weeks ago. Everything my wife saw, everything she knows, signed and witnessed. If something happens to her or to me or to those children, that letter opens, and what's inside it will hang you. It wasn't a bluff. The letter was real. Caleb had written it. Elara had signed it, and it sat in the marshal's office in a sealed envelope marked to be opened in the event of the death or disappearance of Caleb or Elara Mercer, the frontier's version of insurance. A dead man's letter, carrying the truth that the living couldn't safely speak. Drummond rode, his men followed, the yard emptied, the dust settled, and Caleb set the rifle down and sat on the floor with his back against the wall and his hands shaking, because courage is a thing you perform and fear is a thing you feel afterward. Elara came out of the back room. Marin was behind her, Iris on her hip. She crossed the kitchen, knelt beside Caleb, and put her hand on his. Green hand on weathered hand. The temperature difference, her cool, his warm, was the most intimate thing either of them had felt in months. You called us your daughters, she said. I did. You meant it. He looked at Marin, standing in the doorway, watching him with those amber eyes that had been assessing him for weeks, and at Iris, who had fallen back asleep on her mother's hip, unbothered by gunmen and standoffs and the particular noise of adults being brave. Yeah, he said. I meant it. The territorial marshal came 3 weeks later. Not because of Caleb's letter, but because Drummond, in the particular arrogance of a man who has gotten away with things for too long, had made a mistake in another county that drew federal attention. The investigation expanded. Caleb's letter was opened. Elara's testimony was taken. She testified in the marshal's office in Elk Bend, a small room, a wooden desk, a man with a badge and a pen. Elara sat across from him and told the story of her husband's death in the same voice she'd used in the letters. Clear, precise, detailed. The voice of a woman who understood the power of the right word in the right place. The marshal listened, took notes, asked questions. At no point did he mention the color of her skin, because the color of her skin had nothing to do with whether a man had been murdered, and the marshal was the kind of lawman who understood that distinction. Drummond was arrested that autumn. The trial was in the territorial court. Ilara testified again, this time in front of a judge, in front of spectators, in front of the particular formal machinery of justice that grinds slowly, but when it catches, grinds fine. She told the same story, the same clear voice, the same precise words, the same woman who'd written 16 letters to a stranger, choosing her words carefully, building a picture with language, making a man fall in love with a mind before he'd seen a face, used the same talent to put a murderer in prison. The gift was the same, the right word at the right time, delivered with absolute clarity. In the letters, it had been warmth. In the courtroom, it was truth. Same instrument, different key. Drummond was convicted. The land was returned to Jonas Voss's estate, which meant, by territorial law, it passed to his wife. To Ilara, to an Orc woman whose name was now on 2 deeds, her murdered husband's land and her living husband's ranch. The real wedding happened in November, not at the clerk's office, at the church, the Elk Bend Church, small and wooden, with a pot-bellied stove, and a minister who'd been warned in advance and had decided, after consulting his conscience and his Bible, that neither document contained a prohibition against the union of a human man and an Orc woman, and that if God had intended such a prohibition, he'd have been more specific. Caleb wore his good shirt, the same one he'd worn to the stagecoach platform, washed and pressed. Ilara wore a dress she'd sewn herself, green fabric, not hiding the green of her skin, but matching it for the first time, choosing cloth that worked with what she was rather than against it. Marin carried wildflowers. Iris carried a wooden horse. This time, no lies, Ilara said, standing at the altar, her amber eyes on his. This time, no lies, Caleb said. The letters were always true. You told me that. I believe it now. The rest wasn't the hiding, the fear. The rest brought you here. I can live with how you got here as long as you stay. The minister performed the ceremony. The town attended, not all of it willingly, not all of it comfortably, but attended. Because Caleb Mercer had defended his family with a rifle and a dead man's letter, and the particular stubborn decency that frontier communities, whatever their prejudices, respected in a man. That evening, Caleb opened the nursery, not because Iris had climbed in again, though she had many times, but because he was ready. He lifted Margaret's blanket from the cradle, folded it carefully, not the fold of a man discarding something, but the fold of a man putting something precious into storage. He placed it in a cedar box, wrote Margaret's name on the lid, and Samuel's, and set the box on the top shelf of the wardrobe, where it would stay, kept, not forgotten, honored rather than clung to. Then he took the blanket Ilara had made, angular Orc patterns, greens and browns, the geometric designs of her mother's people, and laid it in the cradle, new cloth, in an old bed. Different hands, different traditions, same purpose, to hold a child warm. Iris climbed in before the blanket was fully settled. She was too big. She'd always been too big, but she didn't care, and Caleb found he didn't care either. The cradle rocked, the blanket settled, and the room that had been sealed for 14 months was open and warm, and full of a child's breathing. He stood in the doorway and thought about prayers. 14 months ago, he'd knelt by his bed and asked God to send him someone. He'd imagined a woman, a human woman probably, someone who looked like Margaret or didn't look like Margaret, but who was recognizably, comfortably, expectedly, the kind of wife a widowed rancher on a dirt road might anticipate. God had sent him 16 letters, and behind the letters an Orc woman with 2 daughters and a secret, and behind the secret a mind he'd fallen in love with before he'd seen the face it belonged to, and behind the face a courage he hadn't expected, and a warmth he hadn't earned, and a 4-year-old who thought green was better. "Prayers get answered funny," he said to the dark. "What?" Elara was behind him, in the corridor, watching him watch the cradle. "Nothing. Just, I prayed for a wife, I got a wife, 2 daughters, a murder trial, a standoff, and curtains I don't recognize." Elara smiled. The first full smile he'd seen from her. Not guarded, not calculated, not the careful partial smile of a woman managing how much of herself she reveals. A real smile, with the tusks showing, with the green skin creasing at the corners of her amber eyes. "You also got ironwort stew," she said. "I also got ironwort stew. You like the ironwort stew?" She came and stood beside him, both of them in the doorway of the nursery, looking at a sleeping child in a cradle that had been empty and was now full, wrapped in a blanket that was new and strange and angular and warm. "I have one more thing to tell you," Elara said. Caleb's chest tightened. "What?" "Nothing bad." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote one more letter." She handed it to him. He unfolded it. Her handwriting, the same neat, careful script he'd fallen in love with. The same pen, the same ink, the same mind behind the same hand. He read, 16 letters I wrote you, and in every one I hid a piece of myself, my face, my children, my fear. I gave you my best words and kept my worst truths, and you took the words and saw the woman behind them. And when the woman turned out to be green, you carried her daughter to the wagon anyway. I started writing out of fear. I kept writing because you were the first person in a year who made me feel like a person. And now I'm writing this, the 17th letter, because this one has no lies in it. Not one. Every word I wrote was true. The clouds, the earthworms, the grief. Margaret's blanket is in a cedar box, and a new blanket is in the cradle, and a 4-year-old who thinks green is better than not green is asleep in both. And I am standing in a house that was dead and is alive, married to a man who fell in love with my words before he saw my face. And the face turned out to be the one thing that almost stopped him, and the words turned out to be the one thing that didn't. 16 letters, half true. 1 letter, whole. Your wife, Elara Mercer. Caleb folded the letter, set it against his chest, looked at his wife, his green, amber-eyed orc wife, the mind he'd loved on paper and the face he'd learned to love in person, the woman who'd come with 2 daughters and a secret and a talent for putting the right words in the right order. /17 letters, he said. 17 letters. The first 16 got me to send a ticket. What does the 17th get you? Elara looked at the cradle, at the sleeping child, at the open door of a room that had been closed for 14 months and would never be closed again. Home, she said. The 17th gets me home. The house settled around them, the creak of wood, the whisper of wind, the sound of Iris breathing in a cradle that was too small and didn't care. Margaret's blanket in a cedar box, Elara's blanket in the cradle, 2 names on a lid, 2 names on a certificate, and the particular quiet of a house that had been dead and was learning letter by letter, word by word, to be alive again. Caleb put his arm around his wife. She leaned into him, green against weathered, cool against warm, the temperature difference that Iris had diagnosed months ago with 4-year-old wisdom. Cold and warm is good together. 17 letters. The first one, a lie wrapped around a truth. The last one, a truth with nothing wrapped around it at all. And somewhere between the first and the 17th, a man had fallen in love with a mind, and a woman had found a home, and 2 daughters had gotten a father, and a cradle had been filled, and a prayer had been answered in a way the man who prayed it would never have predicted, and would never, for the rest of his life, have traded for anything.